Design superpower is to evolve abstract into concrete. We build skills and understanding to translate these super abstract concepts into like concrete, relatable outcomes. And this is actually a skill that is generally not talked about much because you always focus on the artifact, focus on the execution. But that translation really requires you to have an intellectual understanding of like what you're translating and how you're translating.
Yeah.
So that's very challenging, actually. And it is a skill that is appreciated only when you see it or when you experience it.
Hey everyone, welcome to Design Drives, where we explore why, how and what design and designers are driving forward. The mission is to interview the most forward-thinking designers and most innovative creators on the planet to inspire and help you to reach your full creative potential and to make a positive impact in the world. In this episode, I had the pleasure to chat with Dogan Sekercioglu, who is a former design lead from IDEO and currently works on future robotic and medical designs at Intuitive in California. With Dogan, I chat about the interplay between the abstract and the concrete, and why this is actually not just a superpower of the designer and how you can apply it, but also allows for incredible impact for both craft-related projects, which are more about the execution, and then also more strategic or facilitation projects, which are more about solving a system problem. We also talk about his experiences working sustainability design projects and how changing the question from solving, which is very often the goal and most commonly the goal, to reducing waste and emissions can actually open up a whole new perspective and new opportunities to innovation. That might be just an iteration, but also a step forward, because moving is better than not moving. So I hope you enjoy the episode. All right, I'm here with Dogan Sekercioglu. Thank you so much for taking time.
Hey Sebastian, it's a pleasure to join. And you did a great job pronouncing my surname.
Yeah, I have a note here. I really tried my best. It's not the easiest for me, but I think I'm really looking forward to chat with you about. We both from UMio. That's I think how we got to know each other, and of course you have a background in advanced design and industrial design. And you got a lot of experience, working in the consulting world with IDEO, and a lot about learnings around like how to design for complex systems and products. Actually, now you work in the healthcare space, which is I think also super interesting, or healthcare device design space. So super curious about chatting with you about that. If you can give a bit of context about yourself, how it all started out for you, living in the US now, but you're actually not from the US originally, actually from Turkey, and I think have also quite an interesting journey that you are running through to come to where you are today.
All right. First of all, thanks for having me. I have been watching the episodes and it's a pleasure to be part of it. I'll start it's kind of a convoluted, a little bit complex journey in the way I built my design career. I actually come from a craft background. My dad was a model builder. It was the family business. So I started building balsa wood models and plastic model kits, and in some cases my own from 7. So craft has always been part of my personality, but I never thought that I can actually pursue this as an education. And being the brother of a scientist, I have been also pushed to have a science education, but I ended up actually getting into urban planning in Istanbul. So I started my undergrad education in urban planning, and I did that for 2 years, and it was actually quite a good experience. When I look back, that actually gave me a lot of my skills that I use today when it comes to systems design and understanding and appreciating complexity. I studied social anthropology, urban history. We started with basic design, but more in the urban planning context. And in that school, I realized there's a discipline called industrial design. Because I started to actually have friends from that department, and I realized we click because also of my background in craft. So back then, this was quite rare, but I convinced my dad and my mom that this is what I want to do. So I went through the whole examinations and portfolio and all that shebang and started studying industrial design. So it was very interesting back then because I was actually doing quite well in urban planning, and my professors wanted to understand why I want to do this switch. And then what I said was like, I really want to be able to be hands-on with the problem that I'm solving, because the urban scale was so huge. And most of the time, it was harder to read the implications of the changes you propose. And they understood it, and they were actually like very encouraging. And I started doing industrial design training. And again, like that's like a kind of a weird shift, because when I started, my heart was at like production design, concept design, and that was my intent when I started my industrial design training. That's where I wanted to evolve. But about like on my third year in school, I got accepted to an internship in Jacob Jensen design in Denmark. So that was like a very actually like enlightening experience, because I start to see how design can be applied in different contexts. This is early 2000s, so design industry was a little less mature back then in Turkey, so it was very hard for me to see what I can do. But that Jacob Jensen experience kind of opened a new understanding for me. So I realized design can be beyond craft. We like, beyond like just making cool looking stuff, especially when you think about the concept design world and production design world. Mm-hmm. And then I just basically got the bug. And like 6 months later, I applied to an Erasmus exchange in Norway. Mm-hmm. And in Norway, I studied strategic design for another 6 months. So these are all of these experiences added years to my bachelor's education. And on my last year, I started also professional working. So I did theater stage design, glassware, packaging. I did like exhibition design for art events. And I also started to understand manufacturing constraints or like the storytelling. But about 2010, it's like I realized this is great, but I really want to build my understanding of design's place in the world. So I applied to IDEO. I got accepted in 2010. It was, like I think the biggest value for IDEO for me was to be exposed to these people all over the world, basically in a small and confined space, like exploring design work. And that kind of led to my internships at IDEO in Cambridge, Design It in Aarhus, and Atlas Copco in Örebro. And then essentially I finished my school, and after a year's stint in Atlas Copco, I started working at IDEO in Chicago. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was like a very complicated.
No, I think the beauty of that is really, what you were mentioning about the different experiences you made from urban design, which actually also I've been looking into when I was starting to pursue some kind of education when I was a teenager. I think urban design also was something that I was looking into, because of course you can shape so much of people's experience, because it's very lasting as well, because it's you do it and it's gonna be people walk through the urban space, like the experience for many years. But I'm also seeing what you said about it's very disconnected to the actual work with an artifact. So that's super interesting that you pointed out. And I think really the nice part is that you have been exposed to all of these different areas of design, which I think make you also a more complete designer by having all of these different perspectives. I think very often I think designers are so much connected to the artifact that we create. So if you design 2 fridges, you're the fridge designer, right? Even though you can do so much more and you have maybe so much more interest about like so many more things, but like because our work is so visual and it's easy to put us into a box, right? And I think I think a lot of people struggle with that. Is you just become a more complete designer by making these different experiences and kind of learning from these different projects. I was recently talking to someone who is really jumping between like footwear design and and automotive design and digital CGI design. And I think the great benefit of that is that, you bring these learnings to these different projects. I know, and as designers, it's very difficult for us to understand, like, where's our inspiration actually coming from? Like, because we come up with ideas, but maybe this idea was like an experiment we maybe made 2 years ago. It's like almost impossible to track back, like, what was the root cause for like an inspirational idea that, someone comes up to. But likelihood is high that it's coming from some kind of experience or some kind of input or some kind of stimulus, right? I think that's just so nice to hear about. Like, you said like the journey took long, but I think also at the same time, like it just exposed you to so much, right? And I think really, just to add one more thing, is like it's very different to, I think, the trend you see in design education these days, where it's about like 3 months and becoming like a designer. Like things take time, right?
Yeah.
And
I mean, I try to see design as, especially in an organization, design superpower is to evolve abstract into concrete. We build skills and understanding to translate these super abstract concepts into like concrete, relatable outcomes. And this is actually a skill that is generally not talked about much, because you always focus on the artifact, focus on the execution. But that translation really requires you to have an intellectual understanding of like what you're translating and how you're translating.
Yeah.
So that's very challenging, actually. And it is a skill that is appreciated only when you see it or when you experience it. And now we are working with these like really abstract, like, and complex systems. Design's role becomes even more important to be that, like connecting tissue in between the abstract and the concrete. And that comes naturally also is informed by your life experiences, whether it is professional or academic, or like just exposing yourself to art or like other things. So having a consulting background for me has been really valuable, because sometimes I solve a problem that I actually had to solve for a fast food packaging project in a medical context. It sounds weird, but it's actually can be really relatable, because in the packaging, you generally get exposed to like economies of scale. So when you actually if you take that concept and then start applying it to other problems in other industries, suddenly you have like this library of ideas that you can pull out from and work with. I mean, of course, it's hindsight, right? When I finished my education, my undergrad education, I was like, I wasted those 2 years in urban planning. And over the years, like the more I have been involved in like more systemic work, like a high level work, the more I learned to appreciate and understand like what I actually gained from that training. And also like this goes on to other experiences that I lived, but like the urban planning was the key one that I was like, why did I do this? But actually it has been really valuable because it gave me the skill to basically step back from the artifact or the problem and see it in a system or a subsystem and start thinking about these relationships. It also over time redefined how I see industrial design.
It's so interesting. I mean, like what you were pointing out about the relationship between urban design and then more physical industrial design, that, this systematic approach that sort of like that links back to maybe an urban design project also, where it's a system design, right? Just the nature of the scale. Yeah, I think sort of that craft aspect, I mean, that's sort of like one experience you obviously made. And then I think that you're also pointing out the other sort of dimension is basically, the craft and the strategic, right? Or the facilitation that you have been pointing out to in terms of like solving these complex problems, where you're a designer, you're not even the person maybe executing everything in the process, but you sort of like facilitate that a process, right, where experts come together to solve a systematic issue, and and I think there also the aspect comes into play what you say about the superpower of design is bringing things from abstract to concrete. And I think that's exactly where I think everything kind of connects. Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the craft part of it, and I'm using craft in the most general sense here.
Yeah.
But like it is a way to translate that abstract to concrete, and then and then the scale is how you execute it, like how you actually like think about that craft aspect and think about how that would translate a certain experience. And then you start to kind of think about the scale as the context. So when they two come together, then you start to think about, okay, like what is the ideal way of bringing this to life? It can be like, making a physical mock-up. It can be like animating. It can be like writing. So suddenly you start to think broadly about that activity of translation, and you start to think about different skill set. So so this way you don't need to be that person doing it, but you're aware of like how to translate and how to make that connection. And then you start to pull resources in to make that translation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so interesting what you pointed out. Well, when you were finishing your education, you didn't recognize the power yet, maybe about like that you were maybe gaining from having these very different experiences and how it made you a more complete designer. But I'm wondering then, as you were going into sort of like pursuing your role as a designer after your graduation, was there certain like a particular project where it was striking to you, or you were realizing how on the one side, basically, it allows you to bring together multiple things. On the other side, also kind of showed you the positive impact that, in an education setup, you can just do it to a limited degree because you're not working closely with industry. But like in your later on after graduation, you obviously, with IDEO also you worked closely with industry about the positive effect that you can have through the role of the designer, right? And the positive effect can be many things, that can be environmental, that can be social, that can be brand, that can be business, but a certain impact. Was a certain, project that made you kind of realizing that?
Mm-hmm. The positive impact can be broken down into like different aspects. Like, like you can have positive impact, like really measurable, like X amount of money or X amount of saving. You can have positive impact when it comes to like how you influence an organization. And this is like not always measurable, but you can see from the way the company's engagement with design changes. And it can just be, cultural. You work with an organization and they are more willing to engage with their user. So I experienced these in these different levels at IDEO, which was very valuable for me. So one of them was like the measurable one, and it is not always like the one that is perceived as positive. But I work with a fast food company on a sustainable packaging project. So this was a very interesting challenge because when we worked with the company and when we got the brief, very quickly we realized the sustainability was this umbrella term, and it was not very well understood by our client, because sustainability, it requires you to put your hand under the rock and like, take that challenge, whether it is an additional cost or additional like work or changing the organization or even, impacting the supply chain and whatnot. It's not cheap in the beginning. So we quickly realized that that word was kind of hollow. So we start to think like, okay, there are a lot of constraints here. And how can we actually have a positive impact within the constraints, particularly the cost constraints of our client? So how can we think sustainability in a different way? So we start to think about, and I'm talking about like 40 plus SKUs of packaging. It's not just like a box or a wrap or anything. So the project was actually involved with all the SKUs. So we start to look into how these packaging items relate to each other. And so we start to actually design it as a system and then have a more of a cumulative impact from that whole system. Because we realized in the organization, these packages were designed over time, independent from each other. So they didn't actually act as a system. So that actually led to basically a packaging system that potentially, not potentially now, it is like they're slowly releasing it after like, I don't know, 8 years. And like they're slowly like releasing these SKUs. And the outcome of this work not only would increase their speed of selling their products, but also take hundreds of tons of plastic out of the system, and also introduce the types of materials that are easier to recycle. Obviously, we want to live in a world that these kind of issues are minimized, and like we don't have this waste. Of course, like that's the ultimate goal. But hopefully that will happen maybe in the next 10, 15, 20 years. But in the meantime, I felt like working with them and then actually creating this impact was still valuable. And that required not only like designing the individual, like the packaging item, but also thinking how these individual items relate to each other and then have a cumulative impact at this whole system. So this was like a kind of a measurable version, because you could actually put this into their mathematical model, and then it will give you like how many tons of plastic, how many and how much time they can save, and etc. And then the other one, the next one is another project, and I'm just kind of again jumping in scale here. I work on a project looking for like the global opportunities in underground water management. So the project that I've been involved in was with a global conglomerate. So they were basically looking for the higher level trends and how the water management can evolve to address the issues of global warming, but also like the way you manage water in the cities and like how it might evolve in the near future. So in this case, our impact was more around how you can utilize design thinking and like user-centered methodologies to still generate solutions that are at this like almost like a country or like city scale. And at least start to have a conversation with the C-level folks. So it was a very interesting project because I was the only like quote unquote hardware product person. And I had to learn water management history. And I had to learn the language because we went to like Argentina, Colombia, talked to the municipality workers, talked to like the sewage treatment plants managers. So I had to kind of develop the language to be able to discuss their problems and how they see this is evolving and like what are the challenges in the management. So one interesting challenge here was that this conglomerate was present both in South America, but also in Europe through subsidiaries. And the European side believed that understanding the problems in South America is not relevant for them because, they have like more advanced infrastructure. But it turns out that, at the core, the problem of the people managing these complex systems are the same. It's just they are represented slightly differently. Like the way they solve is slightly differently, but the core issues were very, very similar to each other. Like you can't have a different kind of global warming in Holland compared to Colombia. You still have the same issues. You just treat it differently. So this work actually led the company to appreciate that, like the similarity and like how the problem definition and how a human-centered solution addressing those problems can still be ever-encompassing, like both in South America and Europe. So the impact in that is just like the understanding of this problem and how human-centered it is at the board level. and this was not, again, like, this is not easy to measure, but from the conversations we had in each of our meetings and shares, and also the client partners, gave us the understanding that they really appreciated this. It almost became like a higher level conversation around like how to understand and solve these kind of global issues in such a large company. So that was that kind of impact. So it's just like slightly different definition of impact. And then the last one was, this is like more cultural, especially like a creative culture related difference. In Chicago, in particular, during my time in IDEO Chicago, I worked in a lot of like mobility UX work, mostly with Ford. Not mostly with Ford, primarily with Ford. And when our relationship first started, I have been mostly an individual contributor, but the way we worked at IDEO, we were working like in these teams that are cross-disciplinary, not in terms of IDEO folks, but we also had a lot of like Ford employees in our teams. We were like collaborating really closely. So one thing that was very interesting was, and you might be familiar with this, like there's a strong culture of transportation and car design. They have a very they have their way of doing things, and it can be like a more of a almost like an apprenticeship model, and it can be like quite intense. And the way we work with it at IDEO, coming from a human-centered background, like, very flat organization. So we were trying to actually like reconcile these two realities and be productive and work in a meaningful manner. So over the years, this relationship had a great cultural impact on the Ford organization and through many projects. And I have observed this just as an individual contributor in the beginning, and then later on, just as in the way I work with the designers from Ford and collaborated with them. And this change happened through working together and through appreciating like what kind of learnings and what kind of impact you can have by pulling the user as close as possible and managing the craft aspect of design meaningfully. Because one challenge early on I was observing was like, naturally the fidelity of a transportation design studio is so high right off the bat that was actually challenging to get like a meaningful input from users. And on the other hand, like the human-centered like approach is to not to necessarily focus on like initially that crafted artifact, but to focus on the experience and interaction touch points and then the physical relationships in the space. So that initially didn't resonate. So we had to like really like find this middle ground that was both like approachable to our research participants, but also meaningful to translate over time for the design studio when we kind of like passed on the torch. So that over time, like I think had a good impact on the Ford's design culture, but also gave us an appreciation of like craft and fidelity and beauty. I mean, especially like not necessarily for me, because I always appreciated that, but like in a cross-disciplinary team, those expectations kind of changes. But yeah, so like, measurable impact in like how you apply design thinking for scale and complexity, and also like having a cultural impact, especially in a creative culture of a company. These were the kind of three examples of how I see the work I have been involved in impacting client work.
Yeah, it's super powerful. I really love all of your 3 projects and stories. I think, I think there's so much to learn from. I really love the fact that you were talking about. I've been doing a lot of episodes now on like the role of design, impact of design. And I think you framed it very nicely. It depends really. Do we talk about measurable impact or like non-measurable impact? And very often the impact that we have as designers is not something you measure directly, but specifically if you come in like with that these experiences you have, and the perspective is that and if you have a strategic project, sometimes the impact is not directly there, but it could add up later on. It changes the process slowly. It starts to spark in idea. It plants a seed. Sometimes it changes in a culture, the process maybe. It maybe is experienceable later on. It's like you're not gonna like root it back right to that project, but it just is an evolution. You accelerate an evolution or steer off an evolution into a certain direction. I of course really love also the project you talked about in terms of automotive. I also made a lot of experiences in that regard about specifically nowadays with mobility. You really have to bring this together. You have the sort of more traditional side, and it has been always very strong in automotive, which is around the craft aspect and the execution and the sort of like physical design. And then the other side is sort of like the human-centric or user experience and the interface aspects. And nowadays you basically have to start to design the car from the seat, from the person, and then design it basically towards the outside. And I think I saw so much great work happening by bringing these 2 worlds together. It takes some time at the beginning because there's 2 different approaches towards design, right? But if both sides appreciate each other and about like what they can add to a project, it really is like where magic can happen, and you just create a more innovative approach. But this is so true in automotive, but you can take literally like so many other industries where you can have the same effect by just basically bringing together people that have been maybe not traditionally working together or have a different way of solving a problem sort of in a similar space. And there's really where magic happens, and it's just so interesting. I mean, like the other thing, other great aspect that I think you're pointing out is that if you work I think all of these 3 projects that you have been working on are all very different in sort of its industry and the nature. And that's a great thing about design, specifically if you work in a consulting setup, especially at IDEO, I believe, is that, you basically are, it's like every project is like reading 5 to 10 books or even more. You're constantly learning something. You're diving into buckets that you know nothing about. And
it is. I mean, it worked for me. And I think like, it really depends on the personality and how you want to work. I don't want to like make a blanket statement that it's great, because it can be stressful, but I like that kind of stress. Like it can be like a little schizophrenic sometimes, and like, just work on like this very small thing or some systemic problem, and then you jump in a completely different industry and completely different product category. But over time, you actually develop like that nature of it helps you to develop kind of like a meta level thinking of how to approach and solve problems. So this way you can a little bit disattach yourself from the individual product. So I think that had a great impact on me that I am using now in my new job, and I think I'll keep applying it to my future career development as well. With the current, like the cultural example, I'm just gonna give it like a very superficial kind of example, but like a more of a symbolic. Like when we were sketching with my team members from the client side, I realized that I always put a human in my sketches, like a hand, or like, and it's like I draw ugly humans. It's not like, it has nothing to do like, just to basically put myself into that moment. So the act of drawing like a character in there, you suddenly start thinking about yourself unintentionally in that moment, experiential moment. And I realized actually my counterpart never did that. And eventually during the course of the project, like we started to actually add like as one or two or like, you know, a human being into these moments. And I think even that one, even though superficial, it might just be like maybe he decided to that he liked putting humans in there, but I don't want to believe that. Over the course of the project, then we start to think about these experiential moments always with a person in it. And I think that act is related to, again, like translating abstract to concrete, because you suddenly actually translate that abstract presence of a human being into a concrete representation. So it was like a kind of an interesting example of how that culture change might happen.
It's very symbolic, like you said, and it just sparks a different way of like approaching a design, right? I think it's so interesting. And I think also back to the 3 projects that you have been pointing out, I think what's also interesting is the packaging project, that, you know, it's a constant iteration. You know, maybe you were even wanted to push it even further, but like we should not underestimate, even with like one step, like, you know, what we can do, you know. And maybe there's a negative connotation about the space of packaging, right? Mm-hmm. And but like that's exactly where we can make impact as designers, by going into these spaces that, you know, maybe you feel like industries maybe that, you know, you feel like could be so much better, you know, by actually going into it and seeing like how you can solve them and dealing with the system, I think, right? And then I think it was great that your learning was that, you know, you have to have a systematic approach and see how other applications of the same idea to make it work because of the scale aspect. Before we're starting here the recording, I think we were chatting a little bit, and I think one of the things I remember is you said, like, you know, it's like making innovation in regards to sustainability, it's never simple, right?
Yeah.
And you know, we have been working a lot on sort of like solving very complex problems through design. And basically, you know, applying like, you know, critical thinking and bringing people together. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about maybe the learnings that you made when it comes to regards of, you know, design in sort of like a very systematic setting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if I go back to the sustainability, sometimes we actually work with a sustainability expert in this project because we right off the bat recognize that this is very complicated. This is not something we just like sit down and solve. So one very interesting thing was like having that sustainability consultant in the team was that she accepted the fact that this is not something to solve, but reconcile and manage. And that was very interesting to me because sometimes we have this, it's like, let's make, like, you know, there's this spectrum of like meaningful impact and greenwashing. Like sometimes we like, make this material, then it will be green. But, you know, circularity is very complex. That requires you to first have a very good understanding of the system you exist in or where this product will exist in. In addition to your material choices, you need to like understand who's disassembling it, like what are the, like, I am having hard time managing my home recycling, you know, like, let alone like thinking about like a product that is built from thousands of parts sometimes that needs to be disassembled and recycled. So it is very complex. So understanding that complexity and reconciling with it, and then having a mindset of like, okay, this is not something that's going to be magically solved, but we will solve it just by doing the right changes in the system level. And then we will have this goal to achieve like maybe full circularity, or however you want to define it in that particular aspect. And like in this project, that was like a wake up moment for me, because this was a national fast food brand in the United States, and each state has a completely different recycling and waste disposal system. So like how do you even manage that? In some markets, people wanted to have a certain material for their drinks, and in some markets, like how much that company is willing to push and make the change. So that is not always necessarily about the design, but also their culture or their willingness to commit to their mission. So suddenly you start to actually identify higher level issues that needs to be addressed that may not be solved with that individual project. But you, like, at least in my case, I try to, like, with my team, solve it as good as possible. Of course, like my brother is a conservation biologist. So I talk about these things with him and he's like, man, how do you do that? I don't, like, it is not ideal, right? Like, but if no one does that, it will not improve. And we are in a place that we can actually have meaningful impact, even so slowly. And just like referring back to a little bit, I mean, this is a bit, I don't want to say controversial, but maybe confusing in terms of what I have been talking with you so far. The urban planning background I had made me realize over time that some problems are not solved, but managed and got better. And that comes from the scale and complexity of those problems and also related to human nature. So every now and then, like, I hear design in context of solving these like really dicey and complex problems. But then that mindset generally defines a solution. And sometimes you just can't solve some things, but to just improve and make it better with like maybe it will never be completely solved, but just by recognizing that and taking the designer's ego out of that act and bringing other partners into the solution actually is way more helpful than, claiming to solve it or like just with an intervention. And that, I think, like looking back now, again, this is hindsight, like, because, this kind of slowly developed in my mind. And I was like, oh, no, this is nothing new. I heard about it in like when Chicago was being built, or when, like in my urban history class, or like, all the, cultural and racial tensions that has been taking place in the world and in American cities. Like these kind of things, the goal is to solve them, but the approach shouldn't be just like coming up with the magical solution, but to understand that they're complex and requires a really like cross-disciplinary, cross-functional approach. And sometimes that nuance gets lost with our excitement of design and like, the human-centered solutions and like just being involved. I just wanted to like share that, especially when it comes to more systemic level issues that also involves like a diverse set of populations.
Yeah. I mean, it's really powerful. I think what you were mentioning, because I think very often I think we approach it's about solving a problem, by recognizing maybe it's about reducing the problem, right? Thinking about as an iteration, just as you're pointing out with the packaging project, right? It's an iteration forward, and like the next project can build on top of it. It's like, like an urban design project, like you said, it's like a city is not built in one day, right? You have multiple urban design projects working together, evolutionizing a city forward. You add one piece, and renew things, right? And you think about it as a sort of like, you think about it as a circular process, or like a constant process as an evolution. I think I really love that aspect, because I think as designers we are so much drawn to completely rethinking and well, rethinking doesn't mean it could not, like that maybe is not the right way of framing it, but we are so much focused on completely removing a problem, solving the problem, right? Yeah. But sometimes it's also about like, making it reduce better. And I think that's also a step forward we should celebrate. Talking about making things better. I mean, also you moved now, working at Intuitive in California on healthcare devices, right? And I think it's interesting if we're thinking about sort of it's a different space, because you work less sort of in a horizontal setup like you maybe did when it comes to consulting. Everything we have been talking about, like maybe so far in the episode, you have to go very vertical, right? And it's also very different in terms of like what exactly you're executing and you're designing. I think before the recording we were talking a little bit about the aspect that nowadays often you can make things feel so real, but I think you were pointing out it really depends on also sort of like how you consume it in the end, right? And very often, like if you work on a UX UI project these days, it's I recently heard this quote from someone that said like it's building sandcastles on the beach, right? Like you design it and it's basically gone. It's really like an iteration, like you said. It's like this packaging project, but just in a short amount of time. With healthcare, well, you consume it not like completely digital, but it has a physical element to it, and it's maybe more something also that has to last for a longer time. So can you talk a little bit about that shift towards designing in sort of like a more vertical setup for you as a designer, and then how that maybe changes your thinking, and then also maybe about the impact that designers can make in the space, and why it's important for designers to kind of help to innovate that space forward, especially in these days.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I like Intuitive designs robotic surgical systems and diagnostic systems. And these products are never static. And they are all like, because of their size and like the application, I don't think just as a physical or like a digital terms. Like I always have to keep in mind that this is a product that has spatial, physical, like object-based and digital side of it. And it literally a living product because it interacts with all the other systems in the OR. It can actually evolve the way it behaves. And it needs to also, on top of it, needs to last for a very long time, as you mentioned, like 10, 15, 20 years. Just developing medical products takes forever. So when you think about this aspect of it, and when you think about like, making abstract to concrete, that what I try to bring most, and like what I try to like champion most, is to make these translations as early as possible in the process, so people can quickly see the impact of certain engineering design decisions right off the bat, because developing them is so complex. It takes so much time, money, effort. So I always think like, first of all, how can I bring these experiences to life in the fastest and most like realistic way, and the cheapest way? And how can I use this to basically drive decisions? So that is kind of like the key engagement that I want to have in these projects. And, I'm new. I have been in the company for a year and a half now. So this is like how I try to see my role. And it actually like has been really helpful because I'm trying to speak in very general terms. But most of the time, a piece of hardware is never a piece of hardware. It is generally has some sort of implication. It does something inside the body. It is an input device that gives you some sort of information on a screen somewhere. So just thinking that as an individual object is making disservice to the design challenge. So translating this complex experience quickly and then understanding how those interactions in between, like the digital, physical, and spatial, actually is the easiest way to communicate how some of your design decisions, even just on the hardware, can be explained. And in some cases, this can even drive technology development. And this is something that I was really like interested in back in consulting in the mobility world. Like, is there a user-centered experiential way of informing, creating new technologies, instead of like creating technologies and trying to find a place for them? And I believe if we, for example, explore, where the information should live when you're using X product or Y product, then suddenly you start to think about like, okay, what kind of input technology we need to develop to actually like create that interaction. And then suddenly you start to think about like building the foundational technologies to develop these products. And I try to basically bring that mindset to my work, actually utilizing very foundational craft skills, but trying to not to be attached with the craft skill, but to the problem and the experiential framework, and then cherry picking the craft skills that will help me to bring that to life. I talk all about like why I like to work like that from a design perspective, but like I also see that like design is the most financially efficient way of managing risk when you're dealing with such complexity, because you can actually really evaluate the value proposition with very low investment. It's never just like someone sitting somewhere designing something and someone else just solving that from an engineering point of view, and they magically come together, because it's so much more multifaceted these days.
100%. I mean, you're touching on some important things there. I mean, I also made a lot of experience working in basically a design strategy setup where you try to, bring in you try to explore requirements for future design, right? So, and I think I really love what you said about like this ping pong between abstract and concrete, and making that step early, right? And you don't do it once, you do it multiple times, right? And by doing that often in the beginning, like you said, like engineering and design just doesn't happen to come together automatically. I think the best would be, if designers also understand and sort of prototype what they would need down the road to have the best possible experience, right? And these things take time. These things time in physical engineering setup. I mean, sometimes, many, many years until you actually have something in place that you can build on and that you can integrate into your product. But if you never make that advocate for that you would need to, maybe the company should invest scientific or research or engineering resources in looking into that, and never understand what it would be the positive impact for the user and for the brand if we would do it, then it never happens, right? And then it's otherwise it's going to be something that there's an enabler there, technical enabler, but it didn't come in initially from a perspective of the best possible human experience, right? The person using that machine or that product, or maybe the patient. So I think that's interesting, and it's not about that designers come up with these things. It's a collaboration between engineering setting where like, okay, could we develop this maybe down the road, right? Would it be worth it for us? How much would it need? Like for how many months or years do we have to work on it to kind of make it happen? So I think it's like everything is a collaboration, right? And like an iteration also, like you said, right? So maybe you can't do it for the MVP, but then you know what you can do like down the road. And
and I mean also like when you frame that right, then you know what MVP is going to be like and what the ultimate version is going to be like, because there can also be like infinite number of things, but you want to have that trajectory of how to develop that experience over time. And if you don't frame it from the get-go, it is really tricky to keep that like vector over time.
You don't know where you're running, right?
Yeah, pretty much. And it's great when you're running, but it's not great when you're actually running a company. One of my mentors, he said, if you can't answer a question in 5 minutes, go build a prototype, because that solves so many of these questions so quickly. And it is also our superpower. Prototype, I'm also, again, using this in the broadest sense. And a piece of animation can be a prototype. And that actually has been also a very practical and a helpful attitude when I'm having these kind of conversations and collaborating with folks, because a lot of the things we talk, again, are actually extremely abstract. And assuming that the person across the table, or the user, or the people we are interacting, assuming that they can just do that leap and make that abstraction in their mind into reality, is expecting a lot. So it's our responsibility as designers to support that conversation. And again, try and make that abstraction into reality, to have more meaningful conversations, because then you end up in this loop, because you say something, the person understands something slightly different. There are constraints in our and biases we already have in our minds. But when you actually experience the experience, it answers so many questions.
It's like a data input, right? It's you just generate data and educate the whole product team. And I think what's interesting is also that basically if you set up this, I really like the fact that you said it's our responsibility to do it. And I think that's also a great way to kind of look at it, right? I think our responsibility for the product quality, responsibility for the brand or for the company and for the human being using it. And if you explore that, that if you go from that abstract to concrete and kind of envision in terms of what it could be, sort of, you mentioned the ultimate version of it, it doesn't have to be right. So, completely right. It's a prediction, it's a speculation, you could say. And then you develop yourself forward, and then basically, you launch the MVP, and then you're going to learn on the first MVP, that maybe the vision was a great way to have a foundation and a discussion within the whole team in terms of where we could go, and we have a motivation now and basically sort of a grand picture. But we also gain data now from people using these products all the time, because there's a big difference between a prototype and the actual product, and and then on this real product you learn so much more. That's I don't know how many prototypes it's worth to have a real product, but it's worth more than a lot of prototypes. And this gonna create a lot more data that's gonna evolve your vision forward, and gonna generate more data points. I really enjoyed the conversation, Dogan. I think we have a really great chat here, and I think we could continue for another 2 hours. I feel like. But I think because of time, I think we have to wrap it up here. So I would just like to thank you on behalf of the audience for taking your time here and spending some time on the Design Drives episode.
Thanks a lot, Sebastian. This was awesome, and thanks for having me. And thanks for pronouncing my surname again perfectly. And hopefully we will have a chat again. Even outside of the podcast, these kind of conversations are lovely, and it's helping to the design community. Thanks
Absolutely.
a lot.
Thank you so much. All right, there was the episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments about your thoughts and biggest learnings from the episode. I'm always super curious about that. You can also tag me in a post about your biggest takeaway and share your insights with others to pass on your learnings. If the episode provided you a lot of value, make sure to follow, subscribe, and share it with friends and colleagues so they also have the chance to learn and grow. Until next time, cheers.